All right, that's as good a signal of any to start the stream. All right, I am live. This is Mark Delacruz coming back to you once again from the Lore Link RPG stream. Apparently now sponsored by Crunchyroll. No, we're not actually sponsored by Crunchyroll, but apparently you can subscribe to earn drops. Thanks, Twitch. It's ironic because the fact that I was just at an anime convention where Twitch had a big, Crunchyroll had a big presence there. So it is. Oh, good. We have captions and sound. Basically, I think they're pushing the big this month because it is anime. I believe is the push for it. But we are here to talk about Lorelink in particular, obviously the software. I'm here to talk about this thing right here to my right. I'm here to talk about my head is huge because this camera is just right there. Okay, there we go. That's slightly better. All right. Basically, I would want sushi except for the fact that sadly the best sushi place I usually go to is closed on Tuesdays for random reasons. But we will suffer. We will make it through this national tragedy. All right, so we are here today to talk about fantasy war, and I made a lot of restraint in not putting just war, what is it good for in the title of the stream. But we are here today basically to talk about war, and more particularly war in your fantasy RPG. Thank you. We're here to talk about war in your fantasy. War never changes. War has changed. Basically, if you're going Fallout is war never changes. War has changed is Metal Gear, ironically. War, what is it good for? I don't know who did that one, but all of those comments basically come to mind whenever you start talking about war. And it's kind of interesting. Like I pulled out this topic because it has kind of become more of a recent months, like this month in particular, next couple of months, war has kind of become a Edwin Starr. Thank you. War has kind of become basically a focus of more TTRPGs than normal. Kind of basically, there's the Heroes of Might and Magic game, which is now on Kickstarter, we'll be talking about later. Pathfinder 2nd Edition will be releasing Battle Cry, which is the basically their how to do mass combat and war in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition system. And Dragonlance, I think, was a couple of years ago, but we're going to talk about that one because that's the other, basically, if you're looking for mass combat in D&D, that's pretty much the closest that you get. So I guess first of all, of course, the question is always, why would you want to include war in your fantasy TTRPG? Why? Basically, most of the time, your fantasy TTRPG games are going to be just basically a single group of heroes. They're going to start off in their home village or little thing, and maybe things will get bigger and more expansive as they go on, and then they'll fight the big bad and basically in a one-on-one battle versus their party versus your big bad, and then they'll walk away victorious, having defeated the evil dragon, rescued the prince, whatever the goal for your campaign was. And a lot of time when I'm talking about, I usually when I run a panel talking about how to prepare for your first game, I talk about basically painting an overall arc, because winning because there's the word game in the title. Winning is often this kind of varied thing, and it's always going to depend on what goals you give your players, and whether or not they feel like they've accomplished them or not, which is going to determine their kind of experience, whether or not they feel they've won, whether or not they feel like they've done something, made a difference. Um, a lot of times in fantasy TTRPG, it's relatively straightforward. It's usually find the guy who is responsible for all this bad stuff happening, punch him in the face until the bad stuff stops, then move on. That's obviously with other game systems it can be more complicated, less complicated. Obviously your particular game could be more complicated if you want it to be, but for a lot of fantasy stuff it boils down to that. D&D in particular, because a lot of times it comes down to that because of the fact that D&D hands your characters a list of ways to punch people in the face. And so you look at that list of I've got 16 different ways I can punch people in the face. I'm going basically as a player, I'm going to look at that list and be like, oh, I want to push these buttons because you gave me these things, and my reward for leveling up is more buttons, and I want to keep pushing them because they're cool and cool things happen and they make my character do cool stuff. Um, and so basically D&D and Pathfinder and a lot of fantasy TTRPGs, not all, but some, are going to kind of lead you in that direction. Um, so that's kind of the basis for your fantasy game. So why would you want to add war into it? You've already got violence going on. Basically, what does putting a war in add for you? Basically, there's a couple of different things that basically war can add to your campaign. Um, the first and kind of obvious thing is war adds scope. Um, Basically, a war is always going to feel big if when done correctly. Your war is always going to be, hey, I want to basically. If you're including a war, it's because you want to increase the scale of what is going on. Basically, war isn't your 5 people versus the one guy and his groups of minions. That's not really war. There's some fights, maybe some battles. Hey, Wolf Mom. But that's not really war. Basically, war is going to be armies. You look at war, you think armies, you think large numbers of troops, you think multiple battlefields, you think multiple large battles, you think countries involved, kingdoms. And that's going to have, basically, you may also be thinking like, oh, hey, this also gives you a way of including more people, basically pulling in more people than just the party into it. So you're looking at, oh, this is going to involve armies and commanders and generals and possibly leaders like kings and queens. It can also pull in innocent people. Battles tend to just happen in places, and generally the innocent people get caught up in it. And so you can increase the scope. Basically, you have the opportunity to put more, basically bring more NPCs, more, we'll call them innocents, neutral third parties, as it were, people who just happen to be in the way. So your war campaign is going to have a much bigger scope than your traditional adventure. It's going to feel like basically the things we're doing is impacting a world, impacting a country. The other thing that basically adding a war in is going to do for you is it's also going to put some structure in, depending on how you do it. If you have your characters being part of the war, suddenly now there's a command structure involved. You're going to focus your campaign, I won't say is railroaded, but it's definitely going to have more structure in it, inherent to the fact that you have a command structure that your players have to report to. They're going to have people who are in charge of them. Possibly they're going to be a command structure that they are in the middle of. Possibly they have troops underneath them. They have people under their under their command as well, as it goes on. Also, it's going to you're going to be if you want something to happen, that command structure is going to be like, okay, you need to go here and do this, or this battle is taking place. We're moving here. We need your group to go scout here, or this is where the next, basically, this is, we have to take this objective, and so we need to basically focus on this town or this area. Your players aren't just necessarily wandering the map looking for where you've put the bad guy. They know where the bad guy is. Basically, the bad guy has drawn up battle lines. It's hard to miss an entire army marching through. So you can have a little bit easier of, oh, okay, basically, if you want to continue with the plot, this is the next section, obviously, here. You're moving with the army. You are basically you're dealing less with, oh, where's your food, where's your other stuff, unless you're throwing in basically things like that to deal with, basically to make complications. Your players aren't like, oh, where are we sleeping, where are we eating? They're being told that, they're being given that, they're given the resources that they need. And so you can add a lot more structure to a campaign with a war setting. Lastly, what basically another thing that basically war can basically it ups the scope. Basically, it gives more structure. It also can give you a little bit more of a definitive ending. Basically, giving you that structure in terms of, hey, this is where the campaign ends. Is when this is defeated. It can give you the idea of like, oh, okay, we need to go to here. Basically, we need to accomplish. Basically, here's the overall objective: is we're fighting off this army, or we are invading this place to save, rescue, take over. However you're building out your campaign, that's a really definitive end to it. So that gives you basically a really solid, basically building when you're basically setting up the arc of your campaign, your players know, okay, this is what the ending should look like, and they should be able to, makes it easier for you if you're seeding stuff, you're putting stuff in, they're going to be like, oh, okay, this is going to help us end the war, or this is going to help us, basically this won't help us end the war. If we fail at this, the war will continue. It gives you a lot more of basically that narrative arc. The last thing it can give you is just really easy reward structures for your players. Players are doing well. They're going to get rewarded by basically not necessarily just here's 30 gold and thanks in your way. They're going to be given basically a promotion, and possibly that promotion comes with more responsibility. And so now it's not just I'm adding some numbers to it. It's, oh, this has actual real world consequences. This has not real world. Bleh. This has in-game world consequences in terms of, oh, okay, basically now I did well, and now they're giving me a promotion, and now I have a troop reporting to me. I have a group of soldiers reporting to me. Maybe one character in particular gets put in charge of the group. So now you have a command structure inside the group. And so that can give you a lot, but it could give you a little bit more of an interesting dynamic to work with. At the same, basically, that dynamic can also be used to add character to your campaign. You're not just basically the soldiers serving under you. Basically, you can give lieutenants and sergeants and things like that, people who are easy NPCs to characterize, to make your characters care about, who they know there's a good chance they might basically at the end of the session might not still be there, because war is like that. It also gives you an easy way of adding, if something does happen to one of your players dies in combat, now you have an easy way of bringing more players in. You can basically, you feel like, oh, you basically, okay, this person died. Basically, that player's new character is a new recruit, or basically a soldier transferred in from another division to help, etc., etc. So there are a lot of different reasons why you could be like, okay, yeah, let's run a fantasy war campaign. Now, all that to say, thing one, as always, session 0 is your friend in terms of you're letting your players know what's going to happen. War can be deeply traumatizing. Basically, war in Warhammer and basically in BattleTech and things like that is really easy to just be clean and nice and neat. There aren't any, basically, there's no one on the battlefield who shouldn't be there. And so, but in basically depending on how deep you as a GM want to go with it, war is pretty horrifying for everyone involved, with the exception of the people really high up who, don't have mud on their boots, as it were. So establish that early with your players of, okay, we're doing war. Basically, we're doing a war campaign, but it's going to it's going to be relatively clean. Or we're doing a war campaign, and we're going to get into a little bit of the messiness of combat and things like that. But that's just basically we're only going to be killing soldiers off. Or, hey, we're going to be getting down and basically we're going to be getting down into it. There's going to be some times where you're going to be dealing with civilians. We're going to be dealing with basically people who shouldn't be on the battlefield being on the battlefield. And are you willing to basically deal with that? Talk about that. Make those hard decisions. Basically, at what level do you want this to be at? That's a good thing for a session 0 discussion. To talk about those sorts of things before you get down into it, and you're slowly like, "Oops, hey guys, basically looked like there happens to be a farmhouse, and that farmhouse that happens to be in the middle of the map isn't empty, and so you had the choice of whether to basically, blow it up with fireballs because the enemy is sheltering behind it." Or do you deal with the fact that there it is? Basically, if you springed it on your players, it's going to be an awkward and bad moment. Also, it's not an excuse to be like, hey, yeah, we're invading a country, so we can do all the looting and pillaging and all the other nasty stuff that soldiers do, that basically mercenary soldiers basically are famously reported to have done. Again, this is basically just because it's what your character will do is never an excuse. Just because that's what happens during that time period isn't an excuse as a GM. Basically talk about this stuff with your players. Basically make sure you have player safety options and things like that. And I would never assume you know what everyone's backgrounds are. That nice player across the table from you who you noted the fact that they basically have a slight accent. May or may not basically have grown up in the same nice war-free country that you did. And they may have stuff that basically they may be uncomfortable with you just kind of treating war as fun and silly. Basically, make sure you know these things in advance. Let's basically all that to say, if you want to run a really deep and intense, horrifying, war is absolutely horrible. Basically, you can always pull out the board game This War Is Mine. That is a very definite, hey, war is hell as a civilian. But maybe not put it into your TTRPG. So, all of that to say, don't get to know your players, don't treat war. If you are, be prepared for some people not to be like, oh yeah, fantasy war is just this fun thing of charging horses. So, all of that to say, if you're looking to run war, what does that mean? We already talked a little bit, increasing scope and things like that. You're planning out both sides here. War is going to add a lot of, is going to put a little bit more burden on you as a GM. Because suddenly the scope of your campaign has, like we talked about, has increased, and that means you have a lot more NPCs and other people running around. Shadow of the Dragon Queen. We'll kind of start with this one, and basically we'll talk about this one, and we'll also talk about how Heroes of Might and Magic does it as well. D&D 5th edition. Here's the short box text for this game is relatively straightforward. Basically, the actual long term, basically bigger one is a little bit more of a spoiler. Basically, you might basically want to include whatever introduction. Again, like we just talked about with content warnings, this is going to be the place where you're going to put in. Basically, if you're sharing this is a great place to. If you're setting this up in LoreLink, this is the place where you're going to put things like Farm to Innocence, Farm to Children. I can't spell starvation. Injury, war, things like that. Basically listing those there means the fact that when your players, basically you send this link to your player, like, hey, I've got this game I want to play. Basically, they're going to be able to look at this and be like, oh, hey, yeah, maybe this isn't what I want to, look at. Basically, this is maybe not a game I want to play in. Thanks for letting me know. And we'll basically either, hey, can we not have X? Or, hey, I'd rather not at this time. Your players also, of course, can always come into here to the player safety questionnaire that we've added into LoreLink. We've got all the things, basically all sorts of things that could go on, inside of a game. So basically, you can mark hey, nope, slavery is right out. I don't want that in my game. The thing is basically drug use. Obviously, drug use and alcoholism can obviously be a thing with soldiers and things like that. Torture, definitely. Basically, permanent injury. Basically, things like that. So as your players can fill this out ahead of time, they save it, and then when they come to join the game, basically there will be an option for them to say, hey, I'd like to share this with my GM. And then as a GM, I can take a look at it and make notes of, okay, here's things that I'm seeing that I'm like, okay, I need to not include this when I'm planning the campaign out. All right, basically, I need to make sure that if I'm basically in this section doing this, I need to make sure that this player knows. And as a player, you can always update these. As a player, you can always remove the option for the GM to see them. And if you're like, I'm not really wanting to show these to the GM anymore because of reasons, they happen, you can always turn that off and take that consent back. All right, but back to the campaign. So, let's grab an image here. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be vaguely annoyed because I have fixed the bug we're about to see here. There's a new fix currently in testing right now that fixes this auto-defaulting back to home. It will in future releases, it will remember your last selection. So you don't have to keep selecting the same thing whenever you're inside that one campaign. So we'll go ahead and add that. One of the first things you're probably going to start looking at when you're looking at a campaign is, oh, hey, a war campaign is, where does this take place? Basically, what is the scope of this war? And oops, that's Dragonbane, not Dragonlance. That's on me. Go ahead and save that. So now we've got the map here. It's a little bit bigger. If I was actually using this, I would probably shrink this down a little bit. This is a great size for if I'm using a VTT. Not as useful as a player thing. But, so, now as basically this map you basically show it to the player. I might have another version of it. I might create a subversion of this, which is my GM map, which has hotspots and other stuff in terms of how I want to do it. Basically, however, if you're doing player sharing, know that any hotspots which are two items that you have not defined, basically you have not shared with players, which again, as a reminder, anything you want to share with the players is up in details down at the bottom here. There's player sharing. Anything which is listed as not shared will not show up to your players. So you don't have to worry about, well, basically if I put a pin there, they're going to go there. Even if they can't see what it is, then they'll put a pin there. Basically, pins do not show up unless they are pins for objects that you have defined. But basically setting up and basically being like, okay, basically this campaign starts off in a number of particular locations. So like it starts off in the basically let me move. And so it starts off in Volgir. Let's see if we can't. This is probably something I should have looked at before. If I can look at where Volgir is. There's Taman Pajik. I used to know this map really well. I grew up reading these books, and so I used to remember really well basically where all the locations are. Kolostani, Tata's Coast, Hearthland, Throt. I want to say it's in this area, but I could be wildly off. Well, basically, as I always say when I'm talking about basically jamming things, if it reaches a point where you find yourself stalling and your players are starting to get confused and bored and look away and look at other stuff, make something up and then come back and correct it later. So if I say Volgir is now here, basically I'd be like, oh, I haven't created the city of Volgir yet. Let me do that really quickly, and I don't have to even leave this screen. I can create the city of Volgir. Save that. And I can place Volgir wherever I want on the map. Ooh, that's huge. Sometimes the dots are a little big. But actually, I don't know why that dot is quite that big. But we'll have to look at that. All right. So basically, putting locations on your map is basically planning out, okay, here are the front line, basically here where the front lines are, here are the key objectives, here are the places that the players are going to encounter, is going to help you be like, oh, okay, so these are the key things that I need to worry about in terms of basically which direction things are moving. Because with fantasy stuff, basically, a lot of times you're like, oh, okay, we're going on a journey from point A to point B. And maybe you will, basically, if you're running a Lord of the Rings campaign, maybe you'll basically run a bunch of expedition stuff, and it has a whole system for downtime and exhibition. Same, basically, Pathfinder does that as well. Even in D&D, you're basically, if you're running, basically, your players are going from point A to point B, maybe you'll throw in some random encounters. And basically, you'll be like, okay, and then you get to wherever you're going, and then you'll deal with whatever is going on to the next location at that point. However, an army moves differently than that. Basically, your army is going to be relatively, basically, you're going to sit up and be like, okay, here's the line that I want the army to take. Here's where the other army is coming in. And basically, when things clash, basically, forces clash, one army can get pushed back, another army, the army will advance forward, taking places. There are points of strategic importance and things like that. Having a map and having those having those available to you and to your players will help them understand the scope of what's going on and being like, oh, okay, we're pushing towards this point. That means we've got this river in the way. How is the army going to get across that river? Maybe you're like, oh, what if they need to go through this pass here, basically the pass in the mountains, things like that. Dealing with locations, possibly naval battles with basically with the sea, basically on the coast. All of those things you're going to want to think about and take into account when you're planning out your basically your campaign. So starting off a map is a great place to start. Pulling out certain things and being like, okay, this location is important, this location is important, this location is important. Here are some key things I'm looking at. So basically, this is going to basically even more true later, but basically how you're going to want to do this is, unless you're running a full miniatures campaign, the likely thing you're going to do with all of these wars and battles is you're going to pull out specific events that you want to be key points in your war. You want this occupation of this town. You want the push through this pass. You want the arrival on travel by sea, basically on boats, and then the landing on this coastline. You're wanting to kind of highlight those key pieces of the war and basically kind of call those out. So you may want to do with that is you may want to have a... that's timelines. You may want to have basically... like the War of the Lance, as it were. You may want to call out create particular events and be like, okay, I'm going to create an event which is the battle at basically in the campaign. Basically, I'm looking over at the actual campaign. Let me actually, I can pull that up briefly. Basically, the game itself is going a lot of the if you're doing a pre-written adventure like the Dragonlance one, it's going to pull out some of those moments for you because you've got the invasion of Vulgar here. You've got basically reporting for duty. You've got arriving in Calzan, basically raided catacombs, the battle at Steel Springs. You're going to have these things laid out for you. As a GM, if you're creating your own, I would suggest you do a similar thing. Have these battles, these particular battles called out, so that you have essentially an idea of how this war is going to progress. Oops, I'm associating an event, not creating an event. That's my problem. Steel Springs. Okay, what other events do we have here? There's the City of Lost Names. I think that's an adventure rather than a player war thing. There's the Siege of Kalman. And things like that. And so you're going to call those out. You're going to associate them on our nice timeline here. Oops. Move that. Okay. Need to save it. There we go. Yep. Should I actually update that this time? It's being a little finicky about whether or not it actually wants to update that one. Let's just make sure, go ahead and do it physically just to make sure. There we go. Associate event. So now basically I've got this battle set up. Now I've got the main ones right now. I might throw in other ones to reflect other battles which are going on nearby that my players may not be directly involved in, but I want to be able to put pressure on the players, or basically let them basically in terms of, oh hey, basically while you were fighting here or while you were off adventuring here, this battle was going on and your side won, lost, gained ground, lost ground. Basically people are hurt. Basically these things happen. And that's going to change the course of the course of it. And if I have those planned out, even if I can pull them in, if I'm running this more freeform style where it's there's kind of two ways you could do this. Again, depending on how much planning as a GM you want to do, and how much you want your players to be in really control of the world. You may need to plan multiple battles and things like that so that you can give your players stuff is going to happen, and then you have levers to pull for. Oh, they did a great job in that last session and moving through this. We'll talk about individual battles here in a second, but they did a great job. They moved through. That means the fact that they're succeeding, so that means I need to pull in these other battles in order to give them more of a challenge. Well, you were winning so well here. Tragedy struck on your western flank, and now you're losing over there, and now you need to choose to deal with how you're going to reinforce that, and things like that. So your supply lines are starting to get harassed, and things like that. And in terms of talking through, okay, yeah, here's the effects of what you did, here's the successes you had, here are the complications you need to deal with. Setting up those overall courses and battles and things like that ahead of time gives you those levers to play with, so that you can be like, oh, okay, cool. Let me get rid of this D&D thing. So I've got all these up on the timeline here, ready to go, and I can add in additional ones, and I can figure out, okay, what do I've got associated timelines. If I want to break a particular battle down into its own thing. Sessions, if I want to keep track of where the game is currently. Sessions could be like, okay, session 1 was between 0 and 1. Session 2 is between 1 and 3. Okay, we're now up to session 2 is going to start at we're coming into timeline 4. That means these battles are happening. And intervals are great ways of also dealing with, I want to deal with a particular, one battle may stretch over multiple other battles. Especially things like sieges. So if I have ever want a... I could say, okay, this is the Siege of Dragonspire. That lasts all this time period. So while these other things are going on, this one big event is going on. I can track that in timelines. Because again, the big difference with an adventure is the fact that you're dealing with a war versus adventure is the fact that you're dealing with a lot of bigger stuff happening, and you want your world to feel lived in. If you're running a war campaign, you're wanting your players to feel like they're part of something bigger than just them. That's definitely the case with this Dragonlance, the Dragonlance campaign. Dragonlance itself, if you are not familiar with Dragonlance, is a series of books written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Came out in the late 80s, early 90s, I want to say. I can't remember exactly when. I could track it back based on when I started reading the books and what grade I was in school, but that's a lot of math that's going to make me feel old. So it details a core group of heroes who are saving the world. And that's basically the end of the campaign is going the end of their adventure. They save the world, the war ends. Then the forces of evil regroup somewhat and they keep going. All that to say, this book takes place during that. I can relate to feeling older. This book takes place during that, and so you're looking at your characters aren't necessarily the main characters of what's going on. The world is getting saved off in a different part of the game world, but your characters are part of this bigger war going on, and so you're going to want you're doing a war. basically this is bigger than just your characters, and you want them to still have an impact on your world. But you need to be like okay, basically you can't just go up. Basically, your individual characters can't. Basically, the point of this adventure isn't that your individual characters are going to go off and beat the end bad guy. They're not going to go off and be like, "Yep, we go off and we kill Tahikis, and the world is saved." Your characters aren't that level, probably. Um, we'll talk about power levels and things like that. But in this adventure, your characters are kind of, you start off at level 1. You're going to be lower ranked. You're going to be basically, this adventure has you kind of slipping in and out of basically kind of being scouts and other things and being peripherally involved in the battles, but not necessarily rank and file soldiers. Depending on how you want to run your campaign, maybe you'll have them be more rank and file soldiers. Maybe you'll have them be more, maybe you'll have them be more independent, mercenary type, as it were. But in any case, so basically, the timeline helps you, basically gives you a feel of something bigger going on while your players are playing. That basically the world doesn't stop just because they're involved in this section of the battle. There's a whole other campaign going on elsewhere. I'm kind of moving my hands and trying to figure out where they are in the frame. But there's a whole world going on, basically adventure, a whole story going on elsewhere that your characters aren't involved in, but they are making you basically, so you want them to feel like that, wow, okay, things are happening, battles are changing, basically big events are going on, and they're doing their small part, but in their small part, they are making a difference. And so that's kind of the approach that this Dragonlance adventure is going in. And so I'm going to encourage, basically, you're going to really want to make that feel like it's happening. Basically, you're going to want those battles going on, those events, and figuring out how those events fit into the bigger world. You're also going to want, basically, NPCs. You're going to end up you're going to want to create kind of a truckload of NPCs and have them as backup, I won't say disposable. Like, you'll want the named NPCs, which are in the book, but I would also suggest creating a bunch of basically, let's say save it like, like here's Private York. Let's see. Let's maybe give them a division they're part of, and then let's give them a little bit of backstory. Let's see, into playing Draconian. Basically something like that. Basically just gonna throw out, create these NPCs and put them in as color in your army. Put them in as basically like, these are people they're encountering, these are people they're meeting. That way when they're like, oh, I need to get this, or I'm going to go, we're going to go do this, or we're taking part in this, you have these NPCs you can just kind of sprinkle in for color. And then basically you can then, if I have an event like the Steel Springs, actually I think I already had Battle for Steel Springs, so I've got the Battle of Steel Springs here. If I choose to throw in basically York, and I use Private York basically as part of this battle, I can assign them to that battle. Now I know why, basically where I use this NPC, what happened. I can add notes to the basically saying what happened to them. If the characters react well to them, I can either continue to introduce them. If I want to add tragedy or pathos to it, I can have York be injured or killed. Or they can basically, if I want to add an objective that I think the players are going to relate to, I'm going to put York in danger because that's someone they met in a mess tent before. But now basically they get injured during the fight and they're basically having difficulty getting off the field and there's a draconian storming at them. Cool, I can bring the focus in on them. So we've talked a lot. Basically, I've talked a lot about basically in terms of basically battles and wars and the general scope. Now to kind of narrow it down and focus in on a particular battle, like what we're looking at here. So what we're going to basically battles are huge. Basically, most of the time they're going to involve large numbers of people, and so Dragonlance handles it basically one of two ways. Well, basically, the major thing Dragonlance did is Dragonlance basically when the Dragonlance book came out, there was also an optional game that came out at the same time. It's called where's Battle of Steel Springs? There we go. Warriors of Krynn. Basically, it was its own board game that came out at the same time. And so if you're doing that, basically, if you're running that, basically, they're like, hey, if you happen to have this board game, miniature game, as well, you can stop what you're doing, and basically you can stop the D&D session, as it were, pull out this game, and they can then have basically you can run that campaign, run that board game scenario, which reflects the battle you're going on in there. They're like, okay, pull out scenario 4 in the Dragonlance Warriors of Krynn book, play that scenario, and then that will be a part of the battle. And after it's done, if they win, they get this reward. If they fail, you can either not give them any benefit, or you can give them you can have them take penalties or injuries or things like that. So that's basically, obviously you can do that. Some systems have rules for that for mass combat. Basically D&D has it with this Dragonlance book. They released that board game, which essentially is their mass combat rules. Paizo is basically releasing their battle cry system, which has its own how do player characters lead armies and do massive battle rules. They're actually running at Gen Con this year. They're actually running demonstrations of that. So if you're curious, like, oh, hey, how does but they're larger scale battles where player characters are controlling sergeants and commanders on battlefields, and then you're moving miniatures around and stuff is happening. That's kind of that's one way that Dragonlance does it. The other way that Dragonlance does it, if you don't want to deal with that, just kind of say, cool, your player characters get there, the battle is raging, and here's the next section. And basically Dragonlance just has a next scenario, basically a next thing for you to do. And so you can then basically move on with the adventure, and the battle is raging in the background, but your player characters are kind of peripherally involved. You're still getting that benefit of being part of something larger. Basically, obviously, whatever part of this battle you're wanting them to be assigned to, you're going to have some color and make it feel like they're taking part in it, that they have an important role. One of the other things that the way battles are even if you're having them take place in the battle, but not necessarily pulling out mass combat rules, what you may the big thing you're probably going to want to do is basically Dragonlance treats it as events. You can see right here, I'll pop this back up briefly. Basically, they have here's the events for this section. Basically, here are some random events that can happen during the combat. Combat is big, it's disorganized, it's chaotic. Don't try to run the entire combat as one long initiative roll. Don't do that. That's your players are going to basically either run mass combat rules and basically which will broaden the scope, make things larger, and basically and kind of deal with things at basically on a larger scale, or if you're bringing it into just your individual characters, basically focus in on individual events. And so you're basically, we would basically, we're using Lorelink, I would add that table in. Let's just go ahead and add table. We'll call it the Steel Springs Battlefield Events. We'll make that, yeah, we'll make that as level 2. We'll basically roll D8, event. Get rid of the last column because you don't need it. And we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. And then we'll just pull in that text. And basically we'll add that in. So basically we're building out this table. We're going to put it in here so that we have quick access to it while we're running the game. The only right ways to plan war are to either intricately plan it down to the very last soldier, considering morale, or intricately national ability, or option 2, just make stuff up as you go. Yeah, exactly. Basically, just basically battles are big chaotic messes, and so unless you pull out and you're showing your players kind of basically the bigger thing, focus in, make it chaotic, make it basically be like, oh, stuff is happening, okay, and here's your moment to deal with it, here's your moment to shine. And I'm going to talk a little bit, basically there's a third approach, basically there's a more detailed report which is kind of between the two of them, which is what Heroes of Might and Magic does, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. So, wrapping this up really quickly. That's 4 to 5. That's 6. That was 8. I missed 7. Yep. I'll just throw that in there really quickly just so you can see what this looks like when we're done here. But this is what it looks like when we're done. There we go. Save it. So, again, basically we'll have this table, roll a d8, something happens. So, basically chaos is going on, and things like that are basically going everywhere. And basically rolling a random events, let them feel involved, lets them feel like, oh, hey, I did something. Like this thing with a wounded Kelvin soldier, basically a dragon elf flies overhead, dropping a screaming Kelvin soldier next to a random player as it does. The soldier dies on impact, if basically it's unsettling, or you could have them live, or basically, again, we talked about earlier about creating random NPCs that you can pull in, basically pulling in those NPCs and be like, oh, that is this person which we just talked to, this person that humanized. Now it's basically, now that character has to make a more of a choice of, do they press on to whatever their objective is, or do they stop and deal with basically, oh, hey, this is the guy who I had dinner with last night and now he's dying in the road. Basically, what's important? What should I do? How should I take care of this? Basically, again, making it humanizing. Again, the point of war is to be large scope, but never lose the fact that you're not playing a war game, as we were just talking about. Basically, all these are individual characters. All these are people. how does that look? How does that feel? How does that affect your players? So talked about a lot Dragonlance and things like that. The other system I'm going to talk about, which I found interesting, is that Modifius has just released. Basically, their Kickstarter is going on right now. In fact, they're actually just released Heroes of Might and Magic, the tabletop role-playing game. This is interesting for two reasons. One of the reasons why it is interesting is because of the fact that this is Modifius's really first time that they're taking their 2D20 system and using it in a more pure straight fantasy setting. So that's really interesting from that. But the other interesting thing is that Heroes of Might and Magic is a computer Might and Magic is an old computer game. Heroes of Might and Magic is only slightly less old. But it was always you have a hero and your hero goes out and basically takes his armies with them. And rather than this isn't a Might and Magic TTRPG where you're just another hero in the Might and Magic world. They actually pulled out, this is Heroes of Might and Magic. And so they decided they were actually going to give this battle rules. And so your character, by definition, starts with armies under their command. So what's interesting about this is you have your resources as a character. You also have units, which you start with as a character as well. So when you start the game, you're like, okay, I've got this type of, I'm playing this type of character. The game has different types of armies that come from different territories, different kinds of cities, because it's a computer game, and so there's 6,000. They created like 6 or 7 or 8 or different factions that all had different heroes that could go with them, and they all had, which become classes essentially in this system, and then they have different armies that can be raised by those heroes. So you get so it focuses in on, okay, here's how this game system works, is that your hero, you have your army. You have your army. One of the types in here is you have armies of undead. You have armies of skeletons. You have armies of orcs or other things, and they kind of go through and they're like, they have the game system's levels of how many units you have are actually used. They use the silly names that the game gave. Where you start with a few, several, pack, lots, horde, throng, swarm, zounds, and legion. And you can your commander, you're a commander and you've got those armies. And so the game works out by you're a hero, you have those armies. When you leave town, the GM will put something in front of you and be like, okay, there is a evil goblin, an evil goblin wizard is marching his armies through your kingdom looking for this artifact. And so your army goes with them. And you're like, okay, we can either try to get to the artifact before they do. We can confront their armies and stop them from attacking villages and things like that. And so it's kind of interesting. You're talking about buy weapons for them. It's they do a lot of the interesting thing they do in this is when you're with your army, you're assumed to have whatever you need. You're a mighty hero. You don't have to worry about food. You don't necessarily have to worry about normal armor and weapons either, because you've got an army. They actually call it the point that if you're an undead sorcerer, if you're a sorcerer who leads army of the undead, you probably have a bunch of rusty pitchforks lying around, because you can always equip whenever your army gets raised, you always have weapons to give them, and so you're always assumed to have them. If you're venturing on your own, if you're just you're going into a dungeon to try to get to an artifact or something like that, then your character just has whatever's on their sheet. But if you're with your army, if something happens and you lose your sword, you break a weapon, or you need something, you decide that swords aren't doing it, I need to switch to axes or whatever, you can spend your what in this system are called battle points, um, which are basically, if you're familiar at all with the Modifius 2d20 system, the Modifius 2d20 system usually has a kind of point system that bounces back and forth between the GM and the players, which gets added to it whenever you get um, basically extra successes on your rolls. You're building up this pool of cool points you could do stuff with. Morale points, that's what it's called in the system. Um, and you get these morale points, and if you want to, you can spend them. And the GM is building up these threat points, which they want to basically up the stakes. Or if you desperately need a reroll, you can give them more threat points. So if you're with your army, you can always be like, "Oh no, I lost my weapon," or "I need this." I can spend battle points and just pull it from my army. Basically, one of my soldiers will note the fact that basically pull it from my army and be able to they'll toss me the sword or an axe or whatever it is, because I've got an army. One of them will see me basically being without a weapon and be like, "Here you go. This is what you need." The spreadsheet of basically fully equipped stuff, but then never use it. Yeah. So often you're like, "Oh, I've got all this cool, neat stuff," but I don't get to use it. It's kind of interesting with this system that they've built some of that in here, and so you get these armies, and basically they have basically, and their battle system has a lot of basically what they call maneuvers, and in terms of when you're fighting, basically whenever you're encountering the battles, the armies clash. Basically, you have an actual battle. They have a separate. They call it a separate type of event. Basically, it is the to be more precise. It is the phase. They have phases. They have the basically preparation phase, where your players start off in town and they make their decisions about how they want to confront whatever threat you've put in front of them. Then they have the adventure phase, which is the exploration phase, where you wander out with your armies and go see what you can see, basically find out what's happening, and then you can stumble into challenges and then deal with those challenges either through, okay, us heroes have to go deal with this personally, you armies stay here, and then you run a more typical TTRPG session where you go into the dungeon, you go out into the field, you fight individual creatures and deal basically and have your back and forth there. Or you can end up basically like, "Oh, we have to confront this evil battle," and you go into battle phase. Which, and basically what they do with battle phase is they don't make you pull out they'll make you pull out a hex map and be like, "Okay, here's basically what's actually play Heroes of Might and Magic." They don't make you go out and buy the other Kickstarter, which is unaffiliated with this giant Kickstarter, to play this giant map and pull out miniatures and things like that. They're like, "Okay, your battles are raging, and your armies have ranges, and ranges are kind of near, basically short range, medium range, and then you have far range. And far range is when you're dealing with the basically the GM just being like, "Nope, you're losing." Sad. That's it's always painful. Basically, and so you've got all of that in terms of basically the ranges and things like that, and they're like, "Okay, you're kind of basically you're going to say, I want my army to interact with this. Basically, I'm going to give them orders, and their orders basically are going to have to do with what the game system calls objectives." And so it narrows the chaos. Basically, it focuses in and says the chaos is happening all around you, but here's what you're seeing. Here's what you're pulling out of it. You're seeing this army moving here to take this important point. You're seeing this this group of innocents or civilians has gotten in trouble and they're stuck over here. You locate the enemy, the enemy leader, but he's stuck behind his troops. Okay, how do you and they say, okay, you have to and the GM can add additional objectives in by spending threats to be like, okay, now here's an instant crisis. Something comes out of the flank that you didn't expect to happen. You have to deal with it immediately. I'm going to spend my threats. And all of these things have progress tracks on them, which are a certain number of successes, essentially, that your players have to get in order to defeat that objective. So if they're like, oh, there's a bunch of catapults back there, they're going to attack the village. If we don't stop them soon enough, I need to get troops back there to interact with it, or I need to sortie out there, or I need to use my magic abilities to deal with it. And basically, it comes down to just rolling. Basically, you're rolling once or twice. You're not rolling for giant encounters. You're not pulling out a ruler and measuring on a map, but you're still basically moving your troops in basically into the can your army have multiple level wizards? How rare how rare is magic? How powerful is the average magic practitioner? Yeah, basically magic is one of those things that basically talking about this game, basically this game handles it by essentially just saying they're just another type of ranged troops that may have some special abilities. Pathfinder basically dealt with it anyway. Basically, Pathfinder basically kind of made it interesting with their Wrath of the Righteous campaign, which was another mass battle system. They used a mass battle system which had been introduced in a previous adventure, and they kind of tweaked it because your player characters were supposed to be hugely powerful, basically a hugely powerful thing. And so the neat thing with mages and things like that is if you handle it correctly, a volley of fireballs, earthquakes, and things like that are going to be disruptive on the battlefield, but you should be able to measure the effect and be like, oh, okay, how much is this going to affect the battlefield? How much is this going to this is going to pull off? You're like, okay, that troop dies, this troop is unaffected by it because they're flying troops, they don't care. It was really interesting, and as the characters got more powerful, that basically they started acting as their own independent units. The wizard basically was like, the big wizard was like, well, how far? Here's the range on my fireball. I'm just gonna chuck it over there. Basically, and just nuke that small section of the army. And so, they basically heroes of magic is just dealing with it by treating them as kind of another type of ranged troop with some special abilities associated with them. I'm sure basically the quick start rules don't go too deep into that. Basically, what army types do they have? Like, they don't really give you a lot of army types for your basically to start with. But basically, and so they're definitely ducking that for now. But I have the feeling that the full book will end up with basically a huge section on basically, okay, these troops get this, they have these, basically they can attack at longer range, they can do a little bit more damage. The player character is where most of the magic lies, and that's kind of how I would treat it unless I really wanted to get into nitty-gritty. If I don't want to make this into a war game, I'm going to treat magic users as a slightly different type of ranged troop. Maybe with a few special abilities that I might be like, they can disrupt terrain. They can do damage and things like that. But I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. They're not overall less or more effective than a group of archers filling the sky with arrows is going to be just as equally devastating to a large set of troops as a fireball, basically a bunch of wizards casting fireball, if you have a whole bunch of 5th level wizards in one place. That said, depending on your world, it may be something that nothing really happens when they don't have that many 5th level wizards. 5th level wizards are considered higher powers, so all you get really is a bunch of wizards casting magic missile all at once, and that's just equivalent to a bunch of archers firing arrows. So you can deal with it basically you can deal with it that way. And so it's one of those where, yes, you can get into the nitty-gritty, and you can kind of really dial into how does this stuff interact. But as a GM, the thing I'm going to want to focus in on is either the events that Dragonlance offers in terms of, yes, I want to run these particular events, and I want certain events to happen to give them little insights into what's happening as they push through. I don't want them running the entire combat. I just want them involved in it. Or I'm going to basically, I like the idea of what Heroes of Might and Magic basically offers in terms of, I want to be able to give them objectives. I don't want to, again, I still don't want them necessarily running the entire combat. I'm not running a war game. But I want to give them objectives to focus in on. I want to break the battle down into basically understandable chunks, and then let them interact with those chunks and let their successes, basically whatever actions they're telling me they're doing, add successes basically to completing that adventure. The other way to look at this is basically stealing the mechanic from Blades in the Dark, treating the battle as a whole bunch of clocks that need to be resolved. Okay, you've got this army coming in. That's one clock. You have to have 3 successes before that army breaks. This army is going to basically, unless you stop them basically getting successes, basically they're going to burn down this bridge, which you need to advance forward. Basically, here's the ballistas in the back. Basically, and every 3 actions you take, I'm going to basically fill in the clock. And basically, when that clock gets filled in, you're going to basically, one of your troops is going to get a section of their clock filled in. Basically, deal with it at a high level, but don't don't bog down into details. Again, odds are good. You'll basically, what we're here to talk about in this thing is adding war into your fantasy TTRPG, not the other way around. If you want to play a war game and have some unique individual basically characters and things like that, there are games and systems for that. BattleTech basically is one of the ones that's kind of more famous for that in terms of BattleTech is a miniatures war game. It is 100% a miniatures war game, but they do sell a book. Just in this game, yeah, we save us all the time and focus on a 3-session dungeon crawl. And some people, you know what, and that is perfectly valid, because with some groups you're going to be like, I just want to focus in on this one thing. I don't want a wider scope. I don't want to deal with the chaos of battle. I don't want to deal with armies and things like that. I want to focus in on just my character interacting with one group of monsters and basically something I can get my teeth on and deal with, and things like that. Basically, there's definitely a time and place for bigger scale and bigger scope and basically getting your players interested in that. And there's also time for, hey, let's just run a dungeon crawl. Let's just have fun. Let's make it simple and straightforward. But basically, either way you do it, basically, of course, the advertisement part of it is, either way you do it, basically, you're going to want to deal with making sure that you as the GM aren't getting overwhelmed. That you as a GM keep things moving. That you as a GM basically have your notes ready and in place, and that is what LoreLink is for. So basically, you can basically adding stuff like tables and events and things like that. Whether you make it a broad focus and you have all of the timelines and other stuff we talked about at the beginning, or whether you just have some of these smaller things that your players are running into, basically as they're going through. Maybe it's one session you come across this, and you're going to want you just sprinkle in these battlefield events off to the side, and then you move on and you keep going. It changes the pace up. It looks a little different, basically, and then you keep going. You don't have to make it the entire focus of your campaign, but if you do sprinkle it in, be ready for it. Have your notes ready. Have basically something like LoreLink where you could link together these things. Like on this event thing, a lot of this stuff basically is like, oh, I've got random dragon army soldier. Basically, if I want to basically add them in, I can just quickly go boop. Dragon army soldier. I can quickly create them. I can add their stats down below. And then I can quickly go in here and be like, oops, I need to actually select them as opposed to Dragon Army Soldier. Pull that out. At creatures. Dragon Army Soldier. Boom. Now I've got a link to them. And again, basically, keep things moving, keep things interesting. Basically, keep your players involved and basically interesting. Don't let this become bogged down. Like as is being commented, players a lot of times they want to be the tip, they want to be the center. They want to have fun. They want to do cool stuff. So keep them involved. Realize what your group is interested in, and basically play to their strengths and play to their interests, but keep them involved. Keep them interested. And basically part of that is just keeping yourself prepared and ready to go. Basically having stuff ready. That doesn't mean you have to have 16 pages of notes. Sometimes it's just simple things like a small chart of events like this. Sometimes it's just having a couple of NPCs ready to go, basically sitting in the wings, and so you don't have to stop and pause the game and flip through stuff to pull something up. Again, basically a lot of these things I've just been basically just poking and being like, I want a character. I can create a random NPC just really quickly, give them a name, give me a few notes on what attitude I give them, what accent I give them, etc., etc. Thus, making it really easy to basically track them. Basically, then I can associate them with whatever I'm doing, and I can just keep track of it and keep going. And basically, that way, when my players come back to it, basically, I've got the same character, the same attitude, the same silly accent I've given them, and my players can feel like, oh yeah, I remember that person. Makes the world feel more lived in. Makes them feel like they're part of something. Basically, even if you're not running giant wars or other things. So, all that to say, thank you so much. Basically, we're going to kind of wrap things up here. Thank you so much for listening. And basically, as we talk through this, again, basically, we talked about the Dragonlance. Basically, that's Dragonlance Shadow of the Dragon Queen. There's also the Heroes of Might and Magic game system we talked about as well. That's currently available on Kickstarter. And of course, last but definitely not least, the thing we're talking about over there is LoreLink. LoreLink is our campaign management tool. All of these features that we've talked about here are available basically inside of LoreLink. Available right now. Basically, you can get two free campaigns. You can try them out, basically create your own campaigns, basically test it out, be like, oh, I like this, I like this. The only thing we don't have available in the free version, which is available now, is you're not able to put hotspots on maps, which I talked about at the beginning, and you're not able to share stuff with your players. All those are both paid features, and those paid features are basically currently only to our Kickstarter backers, but are coming soon. I knock on wood, they're currently in testing, so we're just about there. Hang on a little bit longer, we'll have paid features, I swear. So you can check that out right there. Basically, if you like it, basically follow along with us either on our social media account, Blue Sky, or subscribe to our newsletter, which just came out last week. And you'll find out updates on when we go live with payments, when we have other additional cool streams and other stuff like that. All that stuff is on the Blue Sky and is also on our newsletter as well. Basically, speaking of cool streams, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about basically what we've got going on the rest of this month of May. Next week, we will be back with something a little bit different. We'll be leaving war. Basically after the holiday weekend, basically we're going to come back with something relatively light. I'm going to pull the team basically back in with some kind of funny, silly co-op game. Basically, we'll determine what that is when we get to it. But we'll pick something interesting and see who gets blown up, exploded, or otherwise inconvenienced during our co-op sessions. And then at the end of next week, we will be doing finishing up our Pendragon, another game system which doesn't really do it has mass battles that are in it, but mostly kind of focuses in on the individual characters. So that's another fun, interesting game system. Basically, we started off playing that one last month, or 2 months ago, rather, I think. And so we're going to be finishing that up so you can come watch my character fall off his horse some more and also spout crazy conspiracy theories about Merlin. End of March. Okay. So, yes, 2 months ago. So all that is going on. And all of that, of course, is happening right here on the Twitch channel, which, of course, I am going to say that if you enjoy what we're doing here, please do give us a follow. That will let you know Basically let you know when we're going live with whatever weird and wacky stuff we're doing next, whether next week's co-op game or the Pendragon adventure after that. If you really like what we do here, obviously we will 100% be grateful if you decide to subscribe to the channel, but it is never required. We do not run personalized events, basically only for subscribers or anything like that. Everything on the channel is available for free. Yes, that Merlin fellow, my character in the Pendragon game, is convinced that Merlin is obviously some kind of wacky person. Basically, is obviously plotting something horrible because he keeps hanging around and talking to people about swords and is trying to posture this. Oh, thanks for the follow. Basically, wanting people to wanting people to believe him when he says that Merlin guy's up to something. He doesn't trust him because he's failed every single role in noticing Merlin. So he's convinced Merlin is just trying to put this Arthur kid on the throne for his own nefarious reasons. He's so far convinced a good chunk of the party that that is true. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. So that is next week. And obviously, if you're interested in seeing our previous thing, like whether you want to catch that game or any previous videos we've talked about, our YouTube channel, where we are currently broadcasting right now. Also, after every stream, all of our streams are archived over on YouTube, so you can check us out there and see our previous streams, whether it's me talking about other games, like me talking about Dungeon Crawler Classics a couple weeks ago, or basically covering other things, other systems, Mike talking about Pendragon, things like that. All of that is available basically over there on the YouTube channel. And you can check those out there. And of course, as always, if you're on the YouTube and you want to help us out on YouTube, you can always like the videos, comment on the videos, or subscribe to the channel. Those are all the things that get the YouTube algorithm engaged, and so are always appreciated. All right, I think I've done my due diligence here, and I'm going to stop talking and take a drink, which I should probably have done sometime in the middle. Yeah. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope to catch you all next week. Thanks for stopping by.